They called her the village idiot before they called her a savior. But, by then, the paint on her hands had already mixed with the blistering blisters of a dying world. If you look closely at the bark of an ancient oak, you can still see the faint, chalky residue of a girl's desperate attempt to stop an invisible executioner. They laughed when the first bucket spilled onto the grass. They mocked her when the brush met the bark. But laughter has a horrific way of evaporating when the air itself begins to burn. 15-year-old Alice didn't look like someone who held the secrets of survival in her fragile, calloused hands. To the small, tight-knit town of Oakhaven, she was just the quiet girl who spent too much time talking to the woods and not enough time fitting into the rigid social molds of a community obsessed with appearance. Oakhaven was a picturesque haven, nestled in a valley, a place where manicured lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges were a status symbol. Appearance was everything here, and a teenage girl dragging heavy buckets of cheap, white latex paint through the pristine town square did not fit the appearance they wanted. The mockery started as a whisper, a collective chuckle from the porch rocking chairs, before escalating into open, cruel humiliation. Neighbors would point from their air-conditioned cars, rolling down the windows just far enough to shout jeers at her. They called her the mad painter, the crazy tree girl, a nuisance vandalizing nature. But Alice never looked up. She never wiped the sweat from her brow to argue. She just dipped her oversized brush into the thick, white liquid and kept painting, tree after tree, trunk after trunk, working against a clock that only she could hear ticking. Her hands were raw, her clothes permanently ruined by white streaks, and her back ached with a weight no teenager should ever carry. Yet, she moved with an eerie, frantic purpose that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up if you watched her for too long. It wasn't a tantrum, it was a mission. To understand why a 15-year-old would spend every waking hour coating the local forest in white paint, you have to look at what Oakhaven chose to ignore. Months before the first brushstroke, Alice's grandfather, a retired microclimatologist who had spent his life studying the delicate equilibrium of nature, passed away. He left behind a house filled with handwritten journals, complex weather charts, and terrifying predictions that the local government dismissed as the ramblings of an eccentric old man. But Alice read them. She devoured every page, every equation, every desperate warning about a catastrophic atmospheric anomaly heading directly for their valley. Her grandfather had discovered that Oakhaven sat in a geographical dead zone, a perfect bowl where extreme heat would not just visit, but settle, multiply, and suffocate every living thing if the town's ancient canopy failed. The trees were the valley's only lungs, its only shield. But those trees were already weak, suffering from a subtle, invisible drought that made their dark trunks absorb heat like charcoal. Her grandfather's final notebook contained a single, underlined sentence: "Reflect the light, or the forest will cook from the inside out, and the valley will become a furnace." Nobody believed a dead man, and nobody believed his grieving granddaughter. When Alice brought the notebooks to the town council, the mayor laughed her out of the room, telling her to focus on her schoolwork instead of fairy tales about a killer summer. Left with no choice, abandoned by the adults who were supposed to protect her, Alice spent every penny of her meager savings on commercial-grade white paint and lime. She knew she couldn't save the world, but she had to save the trees that kept her town breathing. The contrast was stark, almost apocalyptic. A sea of vibrant green leaves, sitting atop stark, ghost-white trunks that stretched down the main avenues and spilled into the dense woods surrounding the residential zones. The town took it as an insult to their beautiful landscape. Code enforcement officers issued fines to her broke, single mother who cried at night, begging Alice to stop. The local teens filmed her for social media, posting videos of the crazy paint girl that garnered thousands of mocking comments from people across the country. They thought it was a joke, a bizarre teenage stunt born out of isolation. They didn't see the terror in her eyes when she looked at the horizon. They didn't notice that the birds had stopped singing, or that the morning dew had completely vanished weeks ahead of schedule. Alice endured the cyberbullying, the harsh words whispered at the grocery store, and the utter isolation of being a pariah. She kept painting because she knew that the laughter of her neighbors would be short-lived, replaced by a silence so profound it would tear the community apart. As the days crept deeper into June, the atmospheric pressure above the valley began to subtly shift, validating the terrifying charts Alice had pinned to her bedroom walls. The air pressure became an invisible anchor, heavy and motionless, trapping a massive, growing reservoir of heat directly over their heads. Alice could feel it in her bones. She began waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning, long before the sun could rise and scorch her skin, just to get a head start on the day's labor. Her mother, completely overwhelmed by the social stigma and the mounting stack of local council fines, would stand at the kitchen window, watching her daughter's silhouette move through the morning mist with a heavy bucket in each hand. The local police department even received formal complaints from wealthy property owners who claimed Alice's white trays were driving down the real estate value of the neighborhood. They threatened her with arrest for trespassing and destruction of public property. But Alice simply shifted her focus to the deep, forgotten woods that bordered the public lands, working in secret, painting beneath the cover of the dense undergrowth. She knew that every single trunk she coated was another brick in a fortress that would soon be forced to withstand a literal trial by fire. The laughter reached its peak during the annual Midsummer Festival, a grand outdoor celebration where the town showed off its historical beauty. By this time, Alice had managed to paint nearly 200 trees along the southern ridge and the main pedestrian corridors. The white trunks stood like an army of skeletal sentinels against the backdrop of the festive string lights and colorful banners. The townspeople made games out of it, tossing plastic rings at the white bases, using her desperate act of preservation as a carnival prop. The mayor even made a speech, subtly mocking misguided youth who deface our heritage, while promising that once the summer ended, the town would use public funds to pressure wash the eyesore away. Alice watched from the edge of the crowd, her heart sinking. She looked at the thermometers she had secretly placed around the valley. The ambient temperature was already rising at an unprecedented rate during the nighttime hours. The air felt heavy, thick, and oily. It was the calm before a cosmic storm, a localized thermal trap that was about to spring shut. Within 48 hours of the festival's conclusion, the laughter died. It didn't fade gradually. It was choked out instantly by a wall of heat that dropped over Oakhaven like a solid steel lid. The meteorologists on television spoke in panicked tones about an unprecedented superheat dome that had stalled directly over the region, an atmospheric event so rare and severe that traditional weather models couldn't predict its peak. On the first day of the heat wave, the temperature soared to a blistering 112 degrees Fahrenheit. By day 3, it breached 118. The power grid, pushed to its absolute limits by thousands of air conditioners humming in a desperate bid for survival, shuddered and failed. The silence that followed the blackouts was deafening. No fans, no refrigeration, no relief. The air inside the modern, beautiful homes quickly turned into an oven. The townspeople, trapped in their architectural marvels, began to pour out into the streets, gasping for air, looking for shade, looking for any semblance of relief from a sun that felt close enough to touch. It was during this initial phase of panic that the true nature of Alice's work began to manifest, though few were rational enough to understand it yet. The dark, unpainted trees on the northern ridge, those that Alice hadn't been able to reach, began to warp under the intense thermal radiation. Their dark bark absorbed the relentless sun, heating the internal sap to a boiling point. Leaves didn't just wither. They turned brown and brittle within hours, dropping off to expose bare, dying branches. But the trees Alice had coated in that thick, reflective white paint told a completely different story. The white layer acted as a mirror, bouncing the catastrophic solar energy back into the atmosphere, keeping the internal temperature of the trunks remarkably cool. While the unpainted forest began to crack and hiss under the strain, Alice's white forest stood resilient, its canopy remaining stubbornly green, offering a stark, surreal oasis of life in a landscape that was rapidly turning into a desert. The heat wave intensified on the fifth day, pushing past 122 degrees. The asphalt on the roads began to melt, turning into a sticky black tar that trapped vehicles and made walking impossible. The local river, the lifeblood of Oak Haven's ecosystem, dried up into a cracked, muddy ditch. Panic transitioned into primal survival. The elderly and the young were suffering from heat stroke, and the local clinic was overwhelmed, operating by candlelight without power. People began to realize that their expensive homes were liabilities, heat traps that offered no protection. It was then that someone noticed a bizarre phenomenon on the southern ridge, where Alice had spent months working. The air beneath the white-painted trees wasn't just shaded. It was noticeably, undeniably cooler. The reflective property of the trunks, combined with the surviving, transpiring canopy, created a microclimate, a localized cooling zone that defied the surrounding furnace. While the rest of the town felt like a broiler, the white forest felt like a sanctuary. The psychological toll on the townspeople was immense. Neighbors who had previously spent their weekends competing over who had the greenest lawn were now fighting each other for the remaining bottles of lukewarm water at the local market. The town's infrastructure was completely paralyzed. Emergency services couldn't navigate the sticky, ruined roads, and cell phone towers began to fail as their backup batteries overheated and died. Oak Haven was completely isolated from the outside world, a forgotten island of concrete and timber melting under a relentless sun. In the midst of this waking nightmare, people began to look toward the southern ridge, not just with curiosity, but with a growing, desperate realization that the girl they had ridiculed possessed the only map out of this hell. They had built their lives on the shifting sands of vanity, while a 15-year-old girl had quietly anchored her reality to the immutable laws of science and nature. The realization swept through the desperate community like a sudden gust of wind. The very people who had filmed Alice for jokes, who had signed petitions to have her arrested for vandalism, were now packing whatever water they had left and dragging themselves toward the white-painted trees. The transition from mockery to dependency was humiliating for the townspeople. But survival leaves no room for pride. Families set up makeshift camps beneath the white trunks, marveling at how a simple layer of paint could create a barrier against a heat wave that was breaking national records. The temperature difference beneath Alice's canopy was nearly 15 degrees cooler than the open streets. It was the difference between life and death. The mayor, who had previously joked about pressure washing the trees, was now sitting on a blanket beneath a whitewashed oak, his face pale with heat, exhaustion, and shame. Alice didn't gloat. She didn't stand over them with an "I told you so" expression. Instead, she was still working. Despite the oppressive, dangerous heat, She was out there with her remaining buckets, trying to extend the white perimeter to save more of the dying ecosystem. Her mother, finally understanding the profound wisdom her daughter had inherited from her grandfather, joined her, her own hands now covered in the same white paste she had once cried over. Slowly, a few residents looked up from their misery and saw the 15-year-old girl still fighting for them, even after they had treated her like an outcast. A young man, one of the teens who had posted a viral mocking video of Alice weeks prior, stood up from his camp. He walked over to Alice, his head hung low, and extended his hand. He didn't say a word, but his eyes begged for forgiveness. Alice simply handed him a spare brush. Within hours, a transformation occurred that no one in Oakhaven would ever forget. Dozens of able-bodied residents, inspired by shame and a desperate need to contribute to their own salvation, began raiding local hardware stores, garages, and basements for any white paint they could find. The entire social hierarchy of the town dissolved. Rich executives, store clerks, teenagers, and elderly citizens formed a human chain, passing buckets of white paint into the forest. They worked under the guidance of a 15-year-old girl they had once alienated. The town had become a living canvas of collective repentance. They painted every remaining tree they could reach, working through the brutal heat, driven by the stark realization that their survival depended entirely on the vision of a child they had scorned. But nature is an unforgiving creditor, and the delay in listening to Alice had already set a catastrophe in motion. While the White Forest provided a temporary refuge, the unpainted northern ridge had become a ticking time bomb. The dark, dried-out wood of those neglected trees had reached an auto-ignition threshold under the relentless, concentrated solar radiation. On the 7th night of the heat wave, a sound like a distant cannon shot echoed through the valley. It wasn't thunder. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was the sound of an entire section of the northern forest spontaneously combusting, exploding into a wall of flame that lit up the midnight sky with a terrifying, apocalyptic orange glow. The monster had arrived, and it was hungry. The terrifying roar of the exploding trees woke anyone who had managed to fall into a restless sleep. The sky, which had been a pitch-black, suffocating curtain for a week, was suddenly illuminated by a dynamic, dancing sheet of crimson and gold. The sheer scale of the ignition was something the townspeople had only ever seen in Hollywood movies. It wasn't a slow burn. It was an instantaneous thermal eruption. The intense heat from the preceding days had essentially turned the northern woods into a massive reservoir of highly volatile, dried plant gases. When the first spark caught, the forest didn't just catch fire. It detonated. The shock wave of hot air rolled across the valley, blowing out the remaining glass windows of the abandoned homes in the town center, sending a shower of sharp, glittering debris into the empty streets. The wildfire spread with a speed that defied comprehension, a mountain of fire rushing down the ridge toward the town. The sirens in Oakhaven wailed, a useless metallic scream, since there was no water pressure left to fight a blaze of this magnitude. Evacuation by vehicle was impossible. The melted asphalt on the main roads had trapped cars, turning them into metal obstacles. The only escape route was through the southern ridge, through Alice's White Forest. The community panicked. A mass of terrified humanity fleeing the advancing wall of fire, running toward the only zone that hadn't turned into a tinderbox. As the flames reached the edge of the town, destroying the manicured homes within minutes, the true miracle of Alice's foresight was put to the ultimate test. The fire tore through the residential areas. But when it hit the perimeter of the white-painted forest, something incredible happened. The trees here were not dry and brittle. Their white coating had prevented the internal sap from boiling away, keeping the wood hydrated and living. Furthermore, the white paint itself formulated with lime and fire-retardant compounds based on her grandfather's notes, formed a protective shell. The intense heat of the approaching fire bounced off the reflective white trunks, rather than igniting them instantly. The fire slowed, sputtered, and failed to penetrate the sanctuary. The white forest acted as a natural firebreak, a shield of living wood that held back a raging inferno. The townspeople huddled deep within the white canopy, watching in sheer awe and terror as the flames licked at the white borders but failed to penetrate the sanctuary. Alice stood at the front of the crowd, her face illuminated by the distant fire, her hand resting on the trunk of the first tree she had painted. She had saved them, not just from the heat, but from the fiery wrath of a crisis they had chosen to ignore until it was almost too late. The silence among the refugees was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire outside their white fortress, and the soft collective weeping of a community realizing the depth of their error and the magnitude of their salvation. The heat dome finally broke 2 days later, dissipated by a sudden rainstorm that washed the soot from the air, but left the white paint firmly bonded to the bark. The town of Oakhaven was gone, reduced to ash and rubble, but its people were alive. Every single one of them had survived the deadliest heat wave and wildfire in the country's history, sheltered inside a white cocoon created by a teenager. As they crawled out from beneath the canopy to survey the ruin of their material lives, they looked at Alice with a profound, almost sacred reverence. They realized that true value didn't lie in manicured lawns or social status, but in the willingness to listen to the truth, even when the world laughs at you. Months have passed since the Great Fire, and if you visit the valley today, you will witness a sight that draws travelers from all over the world. The houses are being rebuilt to blend with nature rather than dominate it. But the most striking feature of the new valley is the forest. The white trees still stand, their trunks gleaming in the sunlight, a permanent testament to the summer the earth burned. Across the entire region, other communities have begun painting their forests, creating vast white networks of climate resilience that can be seen from satellite imagery. Alice is no longer an outcast. She leads a youth environmental task force, teaching other communities how to protect their local ecosystems using the simple, effective methods her grandfather devised. The notebooks that were once laughed out of the town council chambers are now preserved in a museum built at the edge of the White Forest, studied by scientists worldwide. Every year on the anniversary of the heatwave, the residents gather in the forest with buckets of white paint, renewing the protective coats of the trees that gave them a second chance at life. It takes courage to stand against the tide of public ridicule, to hold a paintbrush against an oncoming storm when everyone else is laughing. Alice's story is a powerful testament to the impact a single determined individual can have when they prioritize truth over conformity. The next time you see something unusual that breaks the conventional mold of your community, don't rush to laugh. It might just be the very thing that saves your life when the world catches fire. If this story of resilience, survival, and ultimate redemption touched your heart, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this video with your friends and family to spread Alice's message of awareness and courage. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep, cinematic journey into stories that change the way we see the world. Thank you for watching, and stay safe out there.